Thank you for the introduction, of which I understood a few words. It's also very nice to be here back in St. Petersburg after an absence of 19 years, and to also see some of the ways in which the city has also changed and sometimes also changed for the good. So it's been good to see that and to be here at least briefly for that. What I'm going to talk about today is of course not about Russian history at all, but about the Dutch and about the Dutch situation, about their reputation for tolerance, as something that is legendary. It's something that the Dutch have also. It's a reputation they've had for about 4 centuries, so in that sense it's not something new, but it's something that's been around for a long time. Now, I'm going to be using a couple of different definitions of tolerance, and I'm not going to keep on redefining it, but I want to start off with, I want to make a couple of points about tolerance and my definition of very, very briefly. The first is that when people talk about tolerance in an historical sense, certainly when talking about Dutch history in a historic sense, they mean tolerance means a particular thing. And I think it's important for us to understand what tolerance means in this context. Tolerance means learning to live with what you find to be totally unacceptable. This is what tolerance is, okay, in the classic definition. So, now as an American, you know, I grew up with this notion, and I think also modern Dutch has this, but as an American, tolerance has something very, very positive. Tolerance really means is, you know, you embrace, you affirm, you say, I am tolerant, means I warmly accept and support something else, something that's different than my own view on life, something that's different than the way that I would personally believe. But that's something also that the Dutch start from the 1960s and 1970s using, and I'll be pointing to that shift in definition. But tolerance will be in the course of my presentation really about that first definition, about learning how to deal with what you find reprehensible, what you find terrible. And that's something the Dutch have been, by and large, all kinds of exceptions, pretty good at. Okay, so that's a kind of a cold virtue, you could say. I mean, it's learning how to accept what is unacceptable. Is that something that is a good thing, is a bad thing? Is it going to make you feel good about yourself, bad about yourself? These are all complicated things. But what I want to start off by just really emphasizing here is that this is a region, historically, that has been divided by religion. So, in this sense, what do you do with large numbers of people who have a religion that is different than yours? This is the famous iconoclasm of 1566, when, of course, it's also a debate within Eastern Orthodoxy at a different time and place, but this debate was about, this is essentially about an anti-Catholic movement in which the Protestants in all these purple areas went off and destroyed all the statues of the saints that they could find in the churches. So this is essentially sweeping across this part of the Netherlands. Now, this really started off, you can sort of say, a period of religious warfare in the Netherlands at the end of the 16th century. And we could really speak of a religious civil war in which Protestants and Catholics from the Netherlands fought each other and killed each other for religion. So in this respect, talking 1566 or the decades thereafter, we cannot really speak very easily of tolerance. The Netherlands is, of course, part of this confessionally mixed area of Western Europe. The purple is the Protestant, the blue is the Catholic, and you can sort of see that the boundary line cuts across part of the Netherlands. So it makes it, in that sense, like, I might add, Switzerland and Germany, really the 3 countries where Protestants and Catholics have added for a long time. This is in Western Christianity. These are the countries where the conflict is seen most clearly. We will say, though, that after a while, this conflict does settle down. That Catholics and Protestants essentially come to a kind of agree to disagree, in which the great violence of the 19th and 20th century is not something you see between Catholics and Protestants. If you want to see the real religious violence in Western Europe. It's really in the time of the French Revolution between Catholics and anti-Catholics, people who want a secular state, and it's also true in the Spanish Civil War. That's where the real conflicts take place. So not in these countries like Switzerland or Germany or the Netherlands. But still, memories persist. This is a 19th century painting, Catholic painting of the so-called martyrs of Gorkum. They were murdered brutally by Protestants in 1572, and this memory was kept alive by Catholics for a very, very long time. They remembered what happened to these martyrs. So there is this mentality, this framework of religious conflict. It's not that the Catholics ever really thought the Protestants were good people who really meant the best. They remembered. And in the 19th century, they remember more than ever as they become more and more mobilized to essentially fight their own way through. But the fact is, for a time, for these Catholics, they are a minority in a Calvinist or it's a version of Protestantism dominant state. This is William of Orange. This is an ancestor of the current Queen, the first member of the House of Orange to have a kind of a status or title as leader, and he leads a Calvinist republic inspired by this theologian, John Calvin of Geneva in Switzerland. But you see, it remains a kind of a divided country. The red is the Protestant dominant parts of the country. And you can see that it is the dominant faith, geographically speaking, but also in terms of power, in terms of influence, in terms of who's got the good jobs. But all kinds of Catholics down here, overwhelmingly Catholic, hardly a Protestant to be seen in this part of the Netherlands. And even up here, north and west of Amsterdam, all kinds of areas where Catholics are a majority or a very, very large minority. So we are talking about a country that has to deal with religious difference. Now, how do they do this? Now, historically, you can say is that they had to because, well, you can sort of say in very, very simple terms, simplistic terms, it was good for trade. And these are the Staalmeesters. These are people who essentially are board of commissioners who are in charge with the quality, seeing about the quality of cloth, and they are of different faiths. Some of them are Catholic, some of them are Anabaptist or Mennonite, some of them are Reformed or Calvinist, and they have to get along with each other because it's good for business. They're in the same city, so you've got to work together. So tolerance is what the historian Willem Vrijhof called everyday ecumenism. You have to get along well together. So this is tolerance. Maybe personally, everybody finds what the other believes repellent, but, well, when it comes down to everyday work, everyday life, you've just got to accept it. I think another thing is that toleration is a matter of local, practical politics. And this is something that, so it's really about how authorities have to deal with religious difference. This is a church. Well, it's a chapel. It's our dear Lord in the attic. So it's a church in Amsterdam. It's a Catholic chapel in Amsterdam where Catholics started gathering from the mid-17th century onward. The Protestant authorities knew that the Catholics were worshiping there. But it was okay because it doesn't look like a church. So there is no public right to worship. None. Catholics do not have a public right to worship, but they do have freedom of conscience. That is granted them, and if they wanted, what they do behind this facade is something that Amsterdam authorities were willing to allow. Now this varies from place to place. In other places they were a little even more open than in Amsterdam. Lots of places they were a little more closed. But this is one way in which they tolerated. Of course, this is again one of these questions giving our definitions. Is this an example of tolerance or is this an example of intolerance? What's the best definition that you can give to it? But that's how they solved it in Amsterdam. Now in Maastricht, way on the other side of the country, they had a different kind of a solution. This is the Catholic Church, the Sint-Servaas, and this is the Protestant Church, the Sint-Jans. And that is because when the Dutch finally took the city, they had a power-sharing agreement with the Catholic Bishop of Liège, just a few miles to the south. And so each church had formal right to public worship. This was a local arrangement. It counted for Maastricht and a few villages around Maastricht, but elsewhere not. So this is something you can sort of see, another kind of arrangement of tolerance. It's more favorable to the Catholics, but again, locally determined. So tolerance meant different things in different parts of the Dutch Republic. So there wasn't a single recipe, but it was really about what political leaders needed to have happen at that time. Now, in theory, after 1796, the whole issue of tolerance is over because the French come in, not yet Napoleon Bonaparte, he's still behind the scenes, but he'll certainly play a big role in shaping Dutch history after 1800. But in 1795, the French come in. They essentially see to it that a French-like revolution comes to the Netherlands. The Netherlands are also, there are lots of people who want change. And so they say, no state church, no Calvinist republic anymore. We want this to be a place where also Catholics and Jews have equal rights to the Protestants. So, very, very important to note, formal rights for all religious groups as of 1796. That's not changed since that time. But after Napoleon, you have the return of one of the people of the House of Orange, and he's a Protestant king who wants to run the country along his lines. This is the great new church in Amsterdam. It's a church from 1500, no longer used as a church, incidentally, anymore. It's now kind of a museum or a kind of Hermitage. That's right, it is the Hermitage of Amsterdam. And so you can see, but he wants, in a certain sense, to have religion his way, in which he also makes new demands of the Catholics. He wants the Catholics actually to essentially create a church along his lines. So speaking of tolerance, even in the early 19th century, even after the formal equalization, not so much in the Netherlands. Catholics are in that sense also lightly persecuted. Now that doesn't turn out so well for William I, the first Dutch king, because as a result of that he loses the country of Belgium. And it's very, very simply said, but one of the reasons why Belgium became an independent country is because the Catholics there disliked the religious policy of the Dutch king so much that they had to leave. So again, sort of thinking about Dutch as a place of tolerance or tolerant policy, you could argue, at least to a large degree, not to a complete degree, that the history of Belgium is also the history of Dutch intolerance. Now, after 1848, again, we sort of move to a new liberal phase. The Netherlands really becomes something that looks like its current modern representative democracy. Not very many people can vote, but things are opened up. The last major connections to the church are broken in 1848, and religion is freed from the guidance of the state, thanks to the work of J.R. Thorbecke, the author of the liberal constitution of that year. Now you can sort of think, now religion doesn't have to be an issue at all, because everybody really now, more than in 1796, really has free access to all public goods, and people of all religions are going to be treated fairly. But 1848 is just the beginning of a new, monumental political and religious conflict over who will have the say of what goes on in the Netherlands. 1848 invites religious parties to compete in the public sphere. And you see this is also the time of Pope Pius IX, one of the most conservative popes of the modern period. And he urges Dutch Catholics, just like German Catholics and Catholics throughout the world, to mobilize themselves to fight political liberalism and to stand for the Catholic cause against its enemies. And so Dutch Catholics also respond to his call, because they say, you know, we live in a country where we are second-class citizens, where we don't have all the rights as the Protestants do. So the Dutch Catholics, who are 40% of the population, 35 to 40% of the Dutch population, begin to mobilize themselves. Now that's not always easy. For example, the Dutch government, dominated by Protestants, says religious processions are forbidden, at least forbidden in most places, because they see this kind of thing as a provocation of the Catholics. So we cannot allow religious processions. When is that law formally abolished in the Netherlands? 1988. Okay, so not so terribly long ago, although in practice it was allowed for most of the 20th century. So, but this is an example also of how a Protestant state also tries to keep the lid on Roman Catholics. But Roman Catholics assert themselves, and so they build, all of their church buildings were taken during the Reformation, so they come back and put in their own monumental buildings in the public sphere to say, we are here and we count as well. Protestants, you cannot just decide that what goes on in this country by yourselves. We are here and we count too. So you can also think about also the monumental church buildings maybe built in Petersburg in the 19th century, also making political statement. Also thinking about the church, for example, surrounding the also the place where the Tsar was murdered. Okay, so I mean, there's also kind of something being said there, but also in the Netherlands as well. And it's not just they, the Catholics, who do it, but conservative Protestants who differ, who dislike the liberal Protestants who dominate the Netherlands. They say, we too have a say, and we too will come up, and we will defend our own church and our own school, and we want a place at the table too. We will fight for our versions of, in this particular case, gezin and gezag, family and authority. Okay? And by this time in the early 20th century, they see the danger not so much coming from the liberals, but from the communists. The communists as the great danger to the Netherlands. They too mobilize. So we're talking about different religious groups mobilizing in the public sphere. Now, it's not just religious groups. There are also other groups, for example, socialist anarchists, who really break with religion and say, we don't want a religious state of any kind. This is Domela Nieuwenhuis, the first real socialist politician, a former pastor, a former Protestant pastor, we might add, but somebody who breaks with the church and says, we don't want anything to do with the church. But, at least for the time being, by 1920s, it's the religious parties that have the majority in the Netherlands. Catholics plus Protestants, conservative Protestants, are a majority in Dutch Parliament. So they get the say. And they see to it then that they are also advantaged. We get a state by 1920 that is quite religious, quite friendly to religious groups. For example, that's something that is still true today. All religious schools receive 100% funding from the Dutch state. Okay? Just like public schools do, but the idea here is that if parents want to form their own schools on the basis of their own convictions, then the Dutch state must support it and also give room. So this is also an example, of course, of how Catholic education becomes important and where the priests also take a very important role. I think priests play football also in, are there religious football clubs in Russia? Or, okay, so it's... What you get coming out of this, all right, tolerance really becomes now, by the early 20th century, you get a kind of a growing modus vivendi. Everybody's making a claim on the public sphere, and you get the idea here that all religious and non-religious groups are proportionally entitled to state protections and state subsidies. So this is kind of live and let live, so that as Catholics, you have equal access to schools of your choice. You want Catholic schools, you can get those. If you're a conservative Protestant, you can get your conservative Protestant school. And we will do this all on the basis of equity. And that is the model that the Dutch have. This is sometimes called verzuiling, but this is in Dutch. But this is essentially the notion that you get coming out of it here. So this is also a way of coming to, again, how do you deal with religious diversity? How do you deal with religious pluralism? We'll all go our own ways, and we'll divide up the public goods accordingly. That is the principle in which the modern Dutch state in the 20th century was built. For example, radio. You have a single, there's no BBC, for example, British Broadcasting Corporation, no single government corporation running the Dutch radio and later on television system. No, Catholics get their own broadcasting time, Protestants their own, Socialists got their own broadcasting time, and the liberals as well. And so every group gets their own few hours on the radio in the 1930s to listen to their own programming and don't have to listen to the programming of others. Okay? So that's also how this was done. Now, it is a kind of a live and let live and not a case of mutual love. It's not that these groups start loving each other. This is, we dividing up the public goods, but it doesn't mean that we think that people should just simply accept each other. This is a graveyard in the Dutch city of Roermond, and on this side here is the grave of a Protestant officer, and on the other side of the wall is the grave of his Catholic wife. Now, he was an important military officer, and she was local nobility, so they were people of certain means, so they could have their way. They said, "We will be buried together." But of course, people said, well, that's not really possible, because you have to be buried in a Protestant one in a graveyard, and you have to be buried in a Catholic one. So this is the solution that they found, that they are in fact joined in death through a little hand across the wall. But symbolic of this idea that people are, it's not about religious tolerance in the positive sense of the term at all. It's really about dividing up society and living separately from each other. So you can see there the kind of divide in 1930. I think one of the interesting things is you have a very, very large minority. That's something that is very important to note in the Roman Catholic Church. These are the Calvinist churches, not even a majority of the population by this time. This is a very, very high statistic by this time in Western Europe. Not in the Soviet Union by this time, if those statistics would have been held, but by standards of Western Europe, the numbers of people who say they belong to no religion is very, very high. And that again has to do with this fragmented nature of the Netherlands. There's not a single state church where everybody's a member and you sort of are a member because that's sort of your social duty. The Dutch were free in that sense to choose, and you also have a very, very high percentage of none. Very, very diverse by the standards of 1930. It is a divided nation, but up until 1960s anyway, it is a Christian nation. So there are Christian norms that prevail. Catholics and Protestants could agree. For example, strict laws against abortion, strict laws against gambling, other issues as well, and strict laws, formal laws against cremation. Cremation is the first crematorium is built in the Netherlands in 1914, just at the beginning of the First World War. But for the next 40 years, it operates formally illegally because the Christian parties do not want cremation to be placed at the same legal status as burial, which is Christian. So you have this kind of in-between area for this crematorium until 1955, when it is finally legalized. So it's an example of, yes, so also there is room for the crematorium for secular ways of having people come to their last rest. But, again, within the context of a Christian state, it's not entirely equal. Now, that does have some advantages. For example, stability and strength of parties, and religious parties in particular, meant that extreme movements, for example, the Nazi Party, had only limited appeal in the Netherlands. And when the Catholic Church, for example, condemned Nazism, its vote also went down significantly. Same is true in the case of one of the Protestant churches. But over time, after World War II, there are increasingly doubts about the value of these divisions. Protestant, Catholic, religious, non-religious, what does it matter? We live in a world that is growing smaller and smaller, and we need to find ways to reach out to each other and cooperate in the issues that face us all. And one of the people who led this notion is the first head of the World Council of Churches, and that was Willem Visser het Hoofd, a leading Protestant in the Netherlands. And he says, he's a man who also says, we need to think more broadly than we had before. He's also somebody, for example, who negotiated the inclusion of the Russian Orthodox Church into the World Council of Churches in 1961. And he says, we are ready for the Sputnik age, and we must, in fact, bring people in and also see to it that we are living on one world together. So you're getting a new definition of tolerance. We need to be open as never before to the other. And I think you can say that behind this, the 1960s, an expressive event of individualism changed the relationship between religion and politics. People were much less group-oriented than before. Used to think, as a Catholic, I must vote Catholic because I am a Catholic. And this begins to fade dramatically as people think of themselves, at least conceive of themselves, as individuals. So this whole notion of being part of a religious party or being part of even a non-religious party begins to fade in the 1960s. And of course music plays a role in this. I'm not saying that the visit by John Lennon and Yoko Ono to the Amsterdam Hilton changed things overnight, but you understand it's emblematic of this move in the 1960s. Now, because the Netherlands has this very, very widespread or deep experience with different kinds of religions, in the 1960s and the 1970s, new religions that come in are also given very, very easy ways in to develop their own religious organization. For example, Scientology in the 1960s, 1970s comes into the Netherlands without much debate. There's some debate, there's a government report that is out there to say, are these new religious cults dangerous or not? And the answer is no, they're not dangerous. So Scientology is let in as a church and allowed to operate pretty much independently right away. Compare that to countries like Belgium, countries like Germany, countries like France, where that is much more difficult because the laws there on sects, on small groups, is much more restricted. But in the Netherlands, open. Same thing we might say about, for example, Islamic schools. When Muslims come in, they're also given a lot of room to create their own Muslim schools with state support. Much easier, happens much easier in the Netherlands than it does in countries like Germany or Great Britain. So that's something that happens in the Netherlands. So there is room there. And of course religion doesn't disappear as a whole. One of the things that is fascinating about the Netherlands is how important religion is to what is called civil society. Groups essentially mobilizing for some good. Religious groups have been and churches have been very, very important. And also in the peace movement. The largest peace demonstration of all time against the American or the NATO stationing of cruise missiles, which never occurred, but not necessarily for the reasons that they wanted, but the protesting the stationing of American cruise missiles and therefore protesting the arms race was led by the religious peace movements. They weren't the only actors, but they were very, very important and created the largest demonstration for peace held anywhere on the planet, held in The Hague in 1983 to protest this stationing. But nevertheless, decline of traditional religion and religious politics. So those churches that I showed you, those Catholic churches, many of those that were built at the end of the 19th century to show Catholic power in the Netherlands have to be broken down again or turned into have other purposes, maybe turned into stores or turned into libraries because there is no more religious use for them. Think about it this way, just when it comes to Roman Catholic participation. In 1950, 85% of Dutch Roman Catholics went to Mass every week. 85%. That number now is about 8% or 7%. Okay, so you can see a very, very dramatic change in the fortunes, in particular the Catholic Church. Tolerance, then, because religion seems less important, focuses on other things. For example, extending tolerance in a positive sense of the term to homosexuals. Already from the 1970s onward, the Netherlands is always rated #1 of the list in homosexual organizations for its welcoming attitude to homosexuals. So it's always been at the top of the list, or near top of the list, since that time. Part of that had to do, I think, also with the sexual revolution of the 1960s in the Netherlands, that sexuality is very, very important to the new identities of the Dutch, and therefore being able to express yourself fully sexually as a heterosexual or as a homosexual, extremely important to the Dutch. That's something that got a lot of focus in the Netherlands. Also, defense of ethnic and not religious minorities. The Dutch also thought racism was a terrible thing, at least the leading lights in Dutch society in the 1970s and 1980s thought that racism was terrible. They remembered what had happened to the Jews, to Dutch Jews in the Second World War, when 3/4 of them were killed by the Nazis, and the Dutch, deeply ashamed about this by the 1970s, says, we will never, ever let that happen again, and we must fight racism in all of its forms. And so, support of ethnic minorities, this is also part of the culture of the Netherlands. Not all Dutch thought this, by the way. We know in polls that acceptance of ethnic minorities in the Netherlands was a lot less than the public rhetoric, but the public rhetoric was strongly in favor of making sure that ethnic groups are warmly embraced, creating space for such practices, abortion and euthanasia. Euthanasia, of course, is something that's relatively legal. Euthanasia in the Netherlands is relatively unusual in the world even today, but it was created in the 1980s in part on the grounds that this is creating space for individuals and their doctors and their families to make their own decisions. There needs to be tolerance about this. Again, tolerance in that positive sense. That's how it was justified. And also, to a lesser extent, because this was a less emotional issue in the Netherlands, is also about the spiritual freedom of cannabis use. Okay? Report in 1972 saw it also using cannabis as a form of spiritual freedom. Okay? So, in a certain sense, it requires room, it requires tolerance, right? So that's also something that was space in a multi-dimensional sense of the term. That's right. So, now, it doesn't mean that the religious groups entirely go away. You still have traditional groups. This is from the village of Staphorst. This is where they still wear these traditional costumes, not just on festival days, but every day of the week. Some women do dress up this way. And so they still have their own organizations and their own schools. And they are also still given a lot of room by the Dutch government to essentially go their own way. But how far should that go? For example, in the village of Saint-Petersburg in 1992, there was a polio epidemic. Last polio epidemic, and it is because people of a very strict Calvinist church also believed that it was wrong to inoculate your children or yourselves against polio, because that goes against the sovereignty of God, and it's God who decides who falls sick and who remains healthy. And so there's a debate in the early 1990s: should the government force parents to inoculate their children? It goes against the Dutch tradition of letting minorities go their own way, giving them room to make these decisions for themselves. So these are some of the issues that are coming up. And of course, statistically more important is what do you do about Muslims in the Netherlands? Probably about 6% of the population right now, though again, it's not always very easy to count. And it's really about, again, sort of claiming public space, thinking about those Catholic churches. Here's also one of the largest mosques in Europe, I think the largest in Western Europe, where this is also changing the cityscape of a large city like Rotterdam. So what kind of room should be given to the Islamic minority, to Muslims? It's an issue that comes up at the end of the 1990s. So it's been a debate for about 15 years, but especially in the last 10 years, it's been a significant issue in Dutch politics. very modest efforts by Muslims in practice and other religious newcomers to organize themselves. So Muslims haven't been especially good at creating their own organizations that really essentially, they do have, for example, ethnic organizations, if they're Turkish or Moroccan. Especially the Turks are relatively good. Dutch Turks are good at organizing themselves, but by and large, they don't form their own schools. They certainly don't form their own political parties. So in that sense, as a kind of a collective public presence, they're not particularly strong as of yet. But, of course, there is this issue of how will this be in the future. And that's why you have, in fact, also these politicians who say, Dutch people, Islam is a problem. It's something we must pay attention to. It's not just that Islam is by definition radical and therefore prone to violence, but it is that Islam will, as Muslims become more numerous, they will take over Dutch society and ultimately the Netherlands will become an Islamic country. This is the concern of politicians like Pim Fortuyn, and over here, better known certainly by now, I think is the Dutch politician Geert Wilders, who founded a party in which taking a anti-stance against Islam is something he wishes to really accentuate, at least until recently. For example, one of Wilders' points is that also that the Quran should be forbidden in the Netherlands. It's just like Mein Kampf, the book of Adolf Hitler, is also banned in the Netherlands. So too should the Quran be prohibited. So again, different than traditional Dutch accents on religious tolerance in any definition of the term. But of course, all kinds of issues come up. Because Islam leads many Dutch to question how much tolerance should we give to religious minorities. For example, what do we do with a party like the Staatkundig Gereformeerde Partij? This is a Calvinist party which does not allow women to become members. Can it do that or not? The traditional Dutch stance is it's their own group, they've got to decide that for themselves. Okay? And if Dutch women don't like this party, then they can vote for another party. Okay? That's the traditional Dutch view. But okay, this is now a question of, well, should we continue to create room for these religious minorities? And I think also behind this is that, if we let them do it, these small Christian groups that are further no danger to society, what about Muslims in the future? What will they do? Maybe they will create political parties in which Muslim women are also excluded from participation. So this becomes then a new kind of issue. Another issue is must religious freedom trump animal welfare? What do you do about halal meat or about kosher meat that is ritually slaughtered? Do you allow it or not? The second chamber in Parliament passed a law effectively forbidding it with a couple of restrictions on that, but effectively forbidding it. Although the first chamber, the Senate, turned that back and said this law is not good enough to pass. And so for now, ritual slaughter by Muslims and by Jews continues to be allowed in the Netherlands, but it looked for a time like it would be forbidden. So this is also kind of an issue now in the Netherlands. What do you do with those historic religious rights and the rights of believers versus the right of animals not to have to suffer for, and maybe suffer greatly for a number of seconds? So the sentiment is that religious freedom should not be given as wide latitude as before. I think most Dutch think that religious freedom can never justify discrimination. For example, that if religious schools don't want to hire homosexuals, that they must still do so. I think most Dutch think that is now the case. The old view would be that if religious schools don't want to do that, then that's their choice. But now I think they're saying it can never justify discrimination. What about if you feel offended by the speech of others? Should religious people be protected from offensive speech? The general tendency in the Netherlands now is to say, no, they should not be protected against offensive speech. Freedom of speech is such a great good that you must allow it, and you cannot let your stance be that of, would religious people be offended? And I think there are some people in certain circles who say freedom of religion maybe should be eliminated as a right, okay, since it's covered by other kinds of rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and etc. Okay, again, a break with tradition, because freedom of religion often seen as the first of these rights, at least historically, but now seen maybe something that is getting a little too much attention, and we can maybe downgrade it and put it into other kinds of freedoms. Okay, so weighing rights against each other, I think, is always difficult. No one right should always win over another right. It's always a very, very delicate balancing act. So in that sense, I think you should never put one right over another. But there are some concerns about Dutch tolerance concerning religion. Some researchers have said now that they say that Dutch want cultural security that separates them from religious others. That maybe since what Dutch now actually want, maybe the more before us, they want and expect a form of cultural homogeneity. That is to say that they want people to act as they do. There's a kind of a new normal out there, and people whose views are people who look different or have different kinds of practices. In particular, this means, I think, Muslims in the current Dutch case. These are people then who essentially threaten their sense of being at home. Dutch are demanding cultural security from religious others. Okay? There's some indication that this is true. There are other kinds of polls that suggest that young people are actually quite open to people who look differently than they do, who think differently than they do. So in this sense, the jury is still out to what extent this is really a problem, but some researchers say this is really a very clear trend in Dutch society. Second point is Dutch forget that religion is a potent force that should be treated with respect. You know, back in 1960, when Catholics and Protestants distrusted each other, they at least understood that religion was a force that you needed to respect. Now that most Dutch have no ties with religion, what kind of respect is there then for people whose religion is substantially different from the way that they look at the world? My colleague Peter Roy says is that back in those days, people recognized religion was dynamite. It was something that, in fact, was explosive. You needed to treat it very, very carefully. And now that the Dutch themselves are not so religious, maybe they think it's not something that needs to be treated with a great deal of care. And then, of course, Dutch in danger of denying equal access to religious citizens. Again, there are cases of discrimination, in particular towards Dutch Muslims, that has been, in fact, noted in the Netherlands, and that's something that should be a matter of concern. Now, the Dutch, I do think, have great traditions. I think they do have this pragmatic aversion to religious violence. I think they do, in fact, this idea of sort of living together without killing each other or repressing each other is, in fact, an extremely great good, and I think the Dutch have been rightly hailed as a society that have done that historically very well. Religious politics created a lasting and a pluriform public sphere. What I mean also, too, is that religion has also, in some respects, been a good thing for Dutch society because it's served as a motivator from different groups, sometimes competing with each other, to go out in the public sphere and be very, very active. The Dutch civil society is still, at least on paper, one of the strongest throughout the world. Dutch volunteer more than just about any public. The Dutch also give to good causes more than any other public in the world, with a few exceptions. The United States is higher for a number of reasons, but the Dutch really, in fact, do extremely well on this. They're members of organizations. Average Dutch adult is a member of 3 1/4 charities and other kinds of philanthropic organizations or societies. Okay? That's really at the top of the world. And religious people, in fact, are leading the Dutch in these statistics. So in some ways, religious politics has created all kinds of good things for the Netherlands. But the commitment of the Dutch to a genuinely pluralist public sphere needs to be recharged in the 21st century. The fact that the Dutch were tolerant, the various definitions we've given to it in the past, is no guarantee that they will be so in the future. This needs reworking, this needs recommitment also for the future. And what forms that will have, that's something the Dutch will have to figure out in the next number of years. Thanks for listening.